Welcome back to O'Connor Tonight. Following up on a conversation we had yesterday, media is not doing so hot in America these days. People's trust in the mainstream media, Americans' trust in this institution, has plummeted to all-time lows, and it seems like mainstream media is starting to feel the fire. Just recently, the Washington Post had to lay off a number of its own employees. CNN is doing the same thing. But what does that mean for the media ecosystem and for our information? Are we able to trust these institutions now that it seems like they're cleaning house? Or do we need to do a massive redo of what it means to be the mainstream media? Well, here to discuss with me is Rob Bluey. Rob is the executive editor of the Daily Signal. Rob, thank you for coming on and joining the show.
Thanks, Doug. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So the Daily Signal is one of these institutions that seems to have done really well in the post sort of multimedia, mainstream media firestorm. How has the Daily Signal managed to maintain that sort of standing amongst these other institutions as they tend to fall?
Doug, we started the Daily Signal in 2014 at a time when these problems started to really emerge and come to the surface, trust in media specifically. And I think what we saw was the legacy media or the corporate media were not serving their audiences very well. In fact, if you were a conservative or a Christian and somebody who had different beliefs than probably the people in the newsroom at the New York Times or the Washington Post, chances are you are not reading content on those publications that certainly aligned with your views, but in many cases took a diametrically different position. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to bring truthful news reporting as well as commentary and analysis, and we labeled everything as such. News stories would be straightforward and factual. Commentary would obviously come from a conservative perspective. And I think one of the reasons why so many Americans have lost trust in media is journalists have introduced their own political views and perspectives, and they're not being honest about it. Look, if you want to come from a liberal or far left position, just tell the audience that that's what you're doing. And I think that they would naturally adapt and understand.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, one of the most important things here is because we're both sitting here as conservatives. We are both explicitly so. I mean, this is a conservative show. And we're not lying. We're not telling the American people that, you know, we're non-partisan, we're non-biased. We are coming at it from a conservative perspective. Now, we're not lying to them, of course, but why does it seem so difficult for these institutions like a CNN, like a Washington Post, for example, to say, we're liberal, and that's what the news is going to be?
Well, I think it's part of the culture in which they have been trained, both in journalism school. Even back when I have a journalism degree myself, even back when I was going through journalism school at Ithaca College in upstate New York, I mean, it was a far left group of professors who were instructing. From the time that you were in Journalism 101 or Intro to Journalism, you were being directed in a certain way to bring activism into your reporting and to focus on certain types of situations that you wouldn't necessarily find in 20, 30 years prior. And so I think that it starts in the journalism schools. I think that conservatives who are watching this program need to take a hard, close look at where they're making their donations. If you're donating to a college, and particularly a college that is teaching future journalists, take a second look. There are other good programs out there like National Journalism Center, the Fund for American Studies, that train conservative-leaning journalists. So that's the first problem. I think the second problem is when they get into these newsrooms, they're surrounded by people who all think the same. And so it's this reinforcement of their beliefs. Batia Ungar-Sargon has a book which she wrote about how journalism used to be about representing the interests of the working class in America. It's no longer that way.
It's more of an elite club of upper class sort of people. And I think that's so fascinating because, again, that shift has come with some pretty dire consequences. You imagine back in the day a sort of shoe leather reporter who's going out there, he's finding the story and he's holding, truth to power. Whereas the Washington Post's mantra, democracy dies in darkness, rings very hollow when it seems like they're the darkness that tends to be hiding what these people in power are doing.
That's right. It's in many cases, the journalists who are in these positions are, I like to call it like pack journalism. They just follow each other and they do the same type of stories. They maybe write it from a slightly different angle, but chances are, you know what the format's going to be. They're going to be presenting an agenda that's hostile to conservative or Republican types of viewpoints. And you saw this very clearly when Donald Trump was in the White House. I mean, from the very moment that he descended that elevator in New York City, I mean, there was hostility towards his campaign. And in many cases, you saw it through the Russia collusion story. You saw it through so many different stories that the news media, I think, invented and tried to keep alive, not only for their own sake, because they were getting good ratings or selling more subscriptions, but in the case of Trump, they just diametrically opposed to this individual and the beliefs that he had.
Absolutely. And I think that Trump is such a unique case here because without him, it seems like a lot of these places that were sort of riding that Trump high are starting to crash. CNN, I think, being the prime example, when the new leadership came in and said, we need to completely shift our focus here because Trump completely blew up the system. And now we have to go back to reporting the news again, which I'm not quite sure CNN was ever doing that. But Rob, I'm curious, because if you've been in this industry for so long, where do you see this going if they don't correct course? Is there a way for them to do so? And if they don't do that correction, are we just done with the mainstream media?
I don't know that they are, Doug. I think that it's going to be hard for them to make that pivot. I think certain organizations, some institutions like CNN are trying to do that. They at least are talking publicly about going back to the middle and doing the straightforward reporting. But frankly, that's going to be a years or decades long process. I mean, there's such a strong perception in the minds of so many Americans about what CNN is, it's going to be hard to shift that overnight. Sure. And so many of these other organizations, like if you have a sustainable business, which the New York Times seems to have developed, catering to an elite audience of far left individuals, maybe that's their core, and they can get by and continue to do that. And so that's why I think it gives rise to alternative media, places like the Daily Signal, places like O'Connor Tonight, that Americans are seeking out because they're not getting that perspective or point of view from those traditional sources.
Sure. I guess my question too, and we are telling the truth to you folks, that's very essential to, but how do they know? Yeah. How can Americans know that what they're getting from the Daily Signal, what they're getting from O'Connor Tonight, there is such a low trust of media in general? Because, I mean, a certain cabal, I would say, of leftist journalists has completely destroyed credibility. How do they know that our types of sources are giving them the truth?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that, number one, it's important to have a balanced media diet. So don't rely on just one single source. I mean, we are grateful for all of the people who subscribe to the Daily Signal and count that as their morning newspaper, if you will. But make sure that you're reading multiple different sources, including sources that probably don't necessarily fit your political perspective all the time, because it's good to get different points of view. But then I think, anytime you have doubt or are questioning something, we have so many resources just at our fingertips to find out if something is true or not. And oftentimes, this is where I think that packed journalism is problematic, because you will have one news organization, oftentimes a legacy media organization, that will do a story and then others will follow quickly. And then all of a sudden, within a 24-hour period, there's this narrative that begins to develop. It's very difficult to change that. But that's why organizations like ours exist, to push back on those things and make sure that the American people hopefully can decipher what is true and what's not.
Absolutely. And I think that is so valuable as a recommendation to have multiple sources of news, because again, one source of news isn't going to tell you the whole story. That's just impossible. Even if they are one of the best, like the Daily Signal, at giving you truthful information, it can't contain everything. Rob, something you mentioned that's so interesting to me, though, is that idea of going to the other side and hearing what their news story is. We've talked with a number of conservatives on the show that feel as if the way forward for conservatives is to create their own ecosystem, whether that's financial, informational, whatever product you have to have your own separate ecosystem. Is the news something that we should probably try to avoid making that the case?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, there's this whole Substack movement where you have Barry Weiss and Matt Taibbi and Andrew Sullivan and Greg Greenwald and other people who are obviously creating a model, and in the case of Weiss, even creating their own news organization as a result of the success they've had. So I do think that, as somebody who believes in the market and the marketplace of ideas, more is better. Andrew Breitbart certainly had that philosophy as well. And so, with it comes challenges, obviously, deciphering what is true and what is not. But that's where I think I trust the American people to know at the end of the day what is believable, what is not. And if they are going to tune out the Washington Post and the New York Times because that's just not the direction that they think is appropriate for journalism to go, they now have alternative sources that they can turn to. So I'm in favor of that, Doug. I think that it's incumbent upon us, though, as conservatives and as journalists, to uphold the highest standards of being accurate, truthful. If we make a mistake, admit that we made a mistake. And that's how I think you restore some of the credibility and trust with people.
Absolutely. And again, this is so essential. The founders clearly viewed the press as a essential institution. It's the First Amendment of the United States is freedom of the press, right? I think that we need to get back to that position, and I sure hope that outlets like the Daily Signal will help us get there. That was Rob Bluey, the executive editor of the Daily Signal. Great guy. Go check out the Daily Signal if you're interested in some good news. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.